Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
A Pontic replaces the missing tooth in a bridge, and many types of Pontics are used in bridge construction. The principles of design of these are all essentially the same. What I'd like to do is to discuss first of all the principles of design of Pontics, and then to show you some of the various types of Pontics that are utilized in bridge construction. In Pontic design, there is always a conflict between aesthetics and function. If the requirements of aesthetics are met completely, then those of function are not completely met. If the requirements of function are met completely, then something is missing so far as aesthetics is concerned. You can recognize that perhaps in the anterior region of the mouth, aesthetics is most important. And in the posterior regions of the mouth, where aesthetics is not quite so critical, it's possible to concentrate a little more on the functional aspects of design. For this reason, then, the design of Pontics can be divided into two sections, really, posterior Pontics and anterior Pontics. Let's take a look, first of all, at the situation of posterior Pontics. You might think it would be a very easy thing to replace a missing tooth by just having an artificial one which is essentially the same shape and design, and just substitute this in the position in the mouth. The orange tooth in this diagram represents a mandibular first molar with the surrounding alveolar tissue. When this tooth is extracted, changes take place in the relationship of the alveolus there, as you know, and the alveolus recedes away. You can see that a Pontic which was of the natural tooth design would tend to cramp the interproximal tissue against the adjacent teeth there. And so certain modifications are made in the mesial and distal proximal surfaces of a Pontic, and these are tapered away on the mesial and distal to allow more space here for that tissue, and also, of course, it gives good access to the Pontic itself and to the margins of any retainer on the bicuspid and molar in front and behind that Pontic. Other changes which are made in the natural tooth form for a posterior Pontic can be seen from the occlusal surface. And this diagram shows the occlusal surface of the first mandibular molar that we looked at previously. The buccal surface of the tooth is towards the upper boundary of the screen. The lingual surface is towards the lower boundary of the screen. The modification which is made in converting the natural tooth form to a Pontic is to taper off the mesial and distal surfaces of the tooth on the lingual surface. In this way, the interproximal embrasures on the mesial and distal are opened, and better access is given to the underlying tissue and to the retainer margins. Other changes which are made here is to deepen the grooves on the surface. The buccal groove here, particularly in the outer half, is deepened a little. The disto-buccal groove here is deepened a little, as is the lingual groove here. This increases the spillway effect of these teeth and makes a more efficient dispersal of food material from the surface of the Pontic. Other changes which are made in the natural tooth form for a posterior Pontic can be seen in this diagram here, which is a buccolingual cross-section through the mandibular molar that we were looking at. This represents the natural tooth form, and this the cross-section through the alveolus in that area. When the tooth is extracted, of course, changes take place, and the alveolus here recedes away from the tooth, so that a new relationship between alveolus and tooth form is left in position. Certain changes are then therefore necessary in the Pontic design in order to meet this situation, and they can be seen in the next diagram, in which the Pontic form has been developed as is shown here. I think you can recognize that on the buccal surface here, the occlusal 2/3 are left more or less the same as the natural tooth. And then the surface swings in to a point here just opposite to the crest of the alveolus. On the lingual surface, where aesthetics are not at all important, the change takes place at about the junction of the occlusal and middle third of the tooth, and the lingual surface of the Pontic is swung right in to meet the other above the crest of the alveolus in this situation here. This, of course, helps in opening the embrasures, both the lingual embrasure and the proximal embrasures on the lingual surface, and gives much better access in here for cleansing of the Pontic itself and stimulation of the soft tissue in this region here. The relationship of a posterior sanitary Pontic to the alveolus is shown in this diagram. The undersurface of the Pontic is contoured so as to follow the contour of the soft tissue in this area, and a space is developed of about 1 millimeter between the Pontic and the alveolar tissue here. This diagram, I think, also re-emphasizes the point we made about opening the interproximal embrasure on the distal and on the mesial here. It also shows another point which we've not yet covered, and that is in developing an adequate occlusal embrasure in these surfaces here, where the distal marginal ridge of the bicuspid finishes, drops down, comes to the connector, and then rises again to a marginal ridge on the mesial of the molar. You see the same thing on the distal surface here. Marginal ridge of the molar behind dropping down to the contact point, rising again in this area. Important thing to develop in these Pontics, the occlusal embrasures here and here, the opened interproximal embrasure here, and the spacing from the alveolar tissue of 1 millimeter through there. To summarize then the various points which we have made about the modifications of the natural tooth form in developing a posterior Pontic, they are to open the proximal embrasures on the mesial and distal, to open the lingual embrasure by reducing the proximal surfaces of the molar in the lingual half, as you saw in the earlier diagram, and then to change the cervical third of the buccal axial surface and swing it in to meet the alveolar tissue, as seen in previous diagrams. And other points which are important in that situation are to change the cervical two-thirds of the lingual surface, as we saw in an earlier diagram, deepen the peripheral ends of the occlusal sulci or grooves, develop correct occlusal embrasures, and then develop a sanitary or ridge-lap relation to the alveolus. When an anterior tooth is extracted, similar changes occur in the surrounding tissues to those we have seen in the posterior tooth. However, the modifications which are made in Pontic design to adapt to this situation are different because of the importance of aesthetics in the anterior region. This diagram is a labial-lingual cross-section through a natural maxillary incisor tooth. The labial surface is on the right-hand side of the screen and the lingual surface is on the left-hand side of the screen. Following the extraction of this tooth, as you realize, of course, the alveolus will shrink away, as you saw in that dissolve, back again now to the normal relationship of the natural tissue, and then as that fades away. Now you can see that if you were to just project the lingual and labial surfaces of the natural tooth form to meet the new position of the alveolus in a Pontic, that the Pontic would be somewhat longer than the natural tooth. Certain modifications are made to deal with this situation. The lingual surface of this natural tooth form is modified, as you see in the diagram here. It's swung in on the lingual surface to meet the alveolar, the new position of the alveolar crest at its highest point in there. This modification of the lingual surface here also, of course, opens the lingual embrasure, and it helps open the proximal embrasures, as you'll see in later diagrams. Now, modification is necessary, of course, on that labial surface, because at the present time it would be too long. It's been extended to meet the normal tooth situation there, and it would be too long. So the labial surface is modified in the cervical third there by swinging that in, so that it hits the new alveolus at the same level at which the original tooth hit the original alveolus. In this way, the Pontic has the same vertical length, the same cervical incisal length as the natural tooth. And if we can superimpose the original natural tooth over this, I think you can see how the level there between the point of contact of the cervical of the natural tooth and that of the Pontic is in the same vertical level there. And our Pontic seen from the normal view would be of the same length as the original tooth there. This has been achieved by swinging in the labial surface of the Pontic in the cervical third there. This diagram shows a horizontal cross-section through maxillary central incisor and shows the normal anatomical form of that tooth. Modification is made to this to convert it into a Pontic form by adjusting the lingual surface of this tooth. The lingual embrasures are opened as shown in this fade-in on the screen. This opens the interproximal embrasures on the lingual surface, gives good access to the underlying tissue and to retainer margins and the contact areas. It, of course, blends in with the reduction of the cervical third of the lingual surface, and the two operations are carried out in one procedure as the Pontic form is developed on the lingual surface. The labial surface is left unchanged because of the need to maintain the exact anatomical form there in order to maintain aesthetics. So far as the proximal embrasures are concerned, the labial surface is not changed. An anterior Pontic developed along the lines described in these diagrams would lead to a relationship between the Pontic and the alveolar ridge, such as is shown in this diagram here. This is described as the ridge lap type of Pontic. And recognizing in this diagram that the right-hand side of the screen is the labial and the left-hand side is the lingual surface, you can see that the Pontic contacts the alveolus from the labial contact just back lingually to the crest of the ridge, and then the Pontic on the lingual surface shoots away clear from that, opening up the lingual embrasure. This results in a minimum contact of Pontic with the mucosa covering the alveolus, and yet sufficient contact there to give good aesthetics in the finished bridge case. There is another type of Pontic which is used in the anterior situations and sometimes in the posterior, described as the saddle Pontic. And I think you can see how the name is derived from the relationship of that Pontic to the alveolar ridge. It sort of sits across it, much in the way that the saddle does on a horse's back. And the area of mucosa which is covered is considerably greater, nor is it so easily cleansed under there as is the ridge lap type of Pontic. In recent years, this type of Pontic has come to be used less and less, but you may come across some cases of bridges which have been done some years ago which have this type of ridge relationship, so one should be familiar with it. The one on the right-hand side, the ridge lap Pontic, is the one normally used in the anterior situation in bridges these days. Now that we've discussed the various changes that are necessary to the normal anatomical form of a central incisor tooth to create it into a good Pontic form, let's take a look at this chart and summarize the points that we have gone over. We have discussed changing the cervical part of the labial surface to maintain the correct cervico-incisal length of the tooth. We have talked of changing the cervical two-thirds of the lingual surface in order to open the lingual embrasure and to assist in opening the proximal embrasures. And we have also discussed opening the lingual embrasures themselves. These then are the necessary changes in anatomical form that are necessary in developing an anterior Pontic. Now that we've discussed the principles underlying the design of posterior and anterior Pontics, let's take a look at some of the various types of Pontics which are utilized to meet these requirements. Long pin facings have been used for a considerable number of years and serve very satisfactorily as Pontic facings for all teeth in both the maxilla and mandible. Here are some long pin facings. This is a long pin facing for a central incisor tooth. You see the two projecting pins, and on the other side the labial surface already contoured and shaded and characterized for that particular tooth. Here is another long pin facing, this time for a cuspid tooth. And this again is characterized as for a cuspid on the labial surface. On the lingual surface has the two pins which are used to give attachment to the gold backing which is developed around this. Here is yet another long pin facing, this time for a molar tooth. And you can see the development of the two molar cusps. It has similarly two pins on the lingual surface for attachment to the backing. Here is a long pin facing for a mandibular incisor tooth. And because the mandibular incisor is a long, narrow tooth, the direction of the pins is reversed, and they're placed one above the other instead of one on this side and one on the other. So just a little difference in the mandibular incisors in that form. These teeth are made in all the shades of the biform shade guide. And this biform shade guide, running from shades 59 through 82, is utilized to select a particular shade for any patient. These, of course, are detachable in the usual manner of shade guides and can be carried into position in the mouth and placed alongside adjacent teeth so that the shading can be checked and adjusted. Once that shade number is decided upon, it is recorded in the patient's record and is available in the selection of the facings that are going to be used in the construction of the bridge. In addition to selecting the shade for that particular case, it's necessary to select the correct mold. Now here is a mold guide which shows on it all the various molds that are available in these long pin facings. You can see up here it starts with various groupings of maxillary incisor teeth. The lateral, centrals, and laterals come in little sets like this. And they're all in different shades, and in different molds and different shapes and different characteristics. Each one of them has an index number here. So you can pick one of these out of here and take it over to your study cast and try it in position in there and see if it's correct. If it's not, you can put it back again in here and maybe select the next size larger and try this in position and see how that is for that particular case. Once the mold which is required is selected, then all that you do is to note the index number along the side here. So in this way you get a shade number and a mold number. And with those two, you can go to the supply house or the dispensary and ask for that tooth by the shade number and the mold guide. It's necessary, of course, to grind these facings to adapt to the particular case in which they're being utilized. And I'm not going to show you that in this particular presentation, but you see here a bridge which has long pin facings already on it. And the Pontics are this tooth here and this one. These are the two long pin facings. Now these are rather long teeth. This is for an older patient who had some rather severe gingival recession, and you can see that there is a little pink coloration at the top here. It's sometimes done in the long Pontic facing of this nature to place a little pink porcelain which is fused on at the top end here in order that this part of the Pontic blends in with the gingival tissue and gets lost. In the mouth, that looks a little pinker than it does on this TV screen, and there is a fairly definite boundary between the pink and the porcelain. So it tends to reduce the overall length of that particular Pontic. You can see, I think, on the occlusal surface of this tooth here that we've got adequate gold protection of the porcelain. You can see, I think, along the labial boundary here that the gold is just visible on the labial surface and protects that porcelain. The fitting end of this has been adapted to give the ridge lap adaptation of this part of the porcelain and gold to the tissue. Let's take a look at a diagram which shows the relationship of the porcelain facing to the gold backing. In the diagram over on the left-hand side of the screen, the gold coloring represents the gold backing of the Pontic, and the white area is the porcelain facing. You can see the pins projecting through here from the back of the porcelain running through to the gold. This is cemented in position once the gold backing has been made, and the ends of the pin are ground over to give this rivet-like adaptation to the gold backing of the porcelain. Notice the incisal here, where the gold is brought down to protect the porcelain at the edge here, and how the porcelain has been hollow ground just in here to give an extra bulk of gold across the incisal edge so that it absorbs any stresses which fall on here. I think you can see that an impact on any hard food matter, it would be the gold which would receive the first stress in this situation and not the porcelain. Notice that the adaptation of this area to the mucosal tissue here, that the porcelain covers most of this area, is just a little bit of gold in this region here, and this is of course what we have described as the ridge lap adaptation of the Pontic. So here we have gold, the porcelain, the pin going through, and the beveling of that to give a rivet-like finish on this surface here. The black in here represents the cement with which the facing has been fastened in position here. This other diagram here is a cross-section through this at this sort of level here, so that you see the two pins here. This one has gone through, has not yet been ground off to fit into the bevels on either side here. This one has been adapted. This slide in particular shows the nature of the interproximal finish of the gold. The porcelain is beveled so that the gold comes forward and meets the porcelain on the labial surface here, and the same is done on the other side. This gives the adequate amount of gold here for the contact relation, for making the soldered connector, and the position of this is quite strategic. If it gets too far forward, you will show much gold in the mouth. If it is too far this way, the solder from the contact point may run in there and prevent the facing from seating satisfactorily in position. So a recognition of this relationship between the porcelain and the gold, both in this direction and in cross-section this way, is important in understanding the construction and design of this type of long pin facing. The critical nature of this relationship between porcelain and gold here is shown in this other illustration, where the arrow points to that situation. The two blue teeth on either side represent abutment teeth with, say, pin ledge retainers around them seen in cross-section. And you see there the connectors, the soldered joint between the retainer and the Pontic, and how close that comes to the gold into which the porcelain is seated. And you can see that that positioning there is quite critical and has to be worked out on your lab model when these are being constructed. To summarize the long pin facings and to just go through their main characteristics, they can be used in a manner which determines the aesthetics before operating. That is to say, these are prefabricated facings, and you can select the exact ones that are going to be used. They can be ground in and adjusted on a study cast. They can be tried in the mouth, and the aesthetics can be worked out before any preparations are done on the teeth themselves. Because they're made of vacuum-fired porcelain and are very strong and tough, they can be ground to any shape to fit into more difficult Pontic spaces. Having been ground, the porcelain can be repolished without the need to glaze, and this is quite a definite advantage in that regard. It's possible to develop incisal, occlusal, or proximal protection of any type that may be desired, either extremely light or medium or heavy, just as the individual case and its occlusion may require. Should these facings fracture, which they rarely do, it is not too difficult to repair them without removing the bridge from the mouth. They can be used for any tooth around the mouth, from mandibular incisors right round to maxillary molars. They are therefore a very versatile Pontic facing which has many advantages and can be used extensively in fixed bridge work. Now that we've discussed the long pin facing, let's go and have a look at a clinical case which was recorded earlier. This is the first visit in the construction of an anterior bridge for our patient here, which I think you can see quite nicely from this mirror here. It's replacing the right upper lateral tooth, as you can see. We have already taken impressions for study casts of the maxilla and mandible, And our next step is to select the shade for the Pontic facing in this particular case, and that's what we'll now do. As we're using the long pin facing for this situation, we shall use the Bioform shade guide in selecting the shade for this particular case. And from past experience of this type of situation, looking at these particular teeth, one gets a pretty good idea that it's going to be somewhere in the 66, 67 range. And so just as a trial shot, we'll select one of those and put it in position in here and take a look and see how it compares with the teeth on either side. This is shade 66, and it's a pretty good match as I see it from here in this particular lighting. We'll try 67 just to see how that goes, whether we're getting a little darker, a little too dark, or whether it's a little better match. And as I see it from here, I think that probably I would prefer the shade 66, which is a little bit lighter than 67. One has to remember that it may or can be darkened up a little in the cementation process when the Pontic facing is fixed onto the backing. So we allow for that a little bit in the selection of shade at this time. And this shade 66 should be quite a good selection for this particular patient. Anywhere else other than a TV studio, we would perhaps change the lighting a little bit and see how it looked under daylight and so on, just to make a final check. But I think we can be fairly sure that this one will be within the range of adaptation during cementation procedures. So we'll make a note in the record to use shade 66. And that completes this particular part of the operation. At the last visit, you may remember, we took impressions to make study casts for this bridge case, and we also took a shade. In the meantime, those impressions have been poured, and we have our study cast now. The shade which we selected last time was used to select a facing of the correct mold, and that has been ground to fit the mucosal area of the study cast and has been mounted onto this gutta percha base plate here, so that we can try this in the mouth today, and our patient can have a look at it and see how the finished bridge is going to appear. Now we'll place this in position in the mouth. And check it for shade. Now we'll give our patient a hand mirror, and he can take a look at the situation and see how it appears to him. How does that look to you, Mr. Steinhauser?
That's good.
You can see that there are several possible positions for that. We tried to blend it into the adjacent teeth. It's not quite the same relationship as the tooth on the other side, maybe, but seems to us as though it would blend in quite nicely. Another thing is that we want to keep the maximum amount of room on the tongue side here for your lower teeth to come up into relationship with that, so that you won't be able to close together at the moment because of the attachment on the back of that. So you think that would be all right so far as you're concerned?
Yes, looks nice.
Good, fine. You may remember that we use the Pontic facing in position like this, of course, to determine the proximal margins of the pin ledge retainers that we're going to use in this particular case. And if you just turn your head a little that way, good. As you know, we take a pencil and place it on the Pontic facing and into the embrasure as far as we can go, and then draw a pencil line down the adjacent tooth, as you see in that situation there. I think you can just see it. And I think if you visualize that as being the proximal margin of a gold restoration, it would be showing perhaps a little more gold than you'd really want to do in this case. And so what we now do is to take the facing out and then to draw another line on the proximal of this tooth, just about a ½ millimeter or so lingually to the first one. And then we'll pop this facing back again in here, and we'll take a look at that second line that we have drawn in there. And I'm not sure whether on the TV camera here you can just exactly see that, but from where I am, it's a sort of happy compromise that would bring the gold far enough forward for self-cleansing and for a good contact point, and yet would not be showing any more gold than is necessary. And then we do the same thing on the proximal surface of the cuspid tooth. And if you just turn your head this way, we can do that. In this particular situation here with an imbricated tooth, I think you can see in here that the position of the gold margin there is quite critical. For example, if you were thinking of doing a 3/4 crown on this tooth, you would find yourself having to come way onto the proximal surface here in order to get the proximal retention groove. And in this situation, the pin ledge has considerable advantages. That's the first line drawn on the proximal of the cuspid tooth there. We'll take this out now and draw the second line, which will be just lingual to that. And then pop our facing back again and take a look at that second line, which you cannot see because of the relationship of the teeth, and that means that it's just nicely hidden from view there. So we're now ready to go ahead and do the preparations on the pin ledges, which is not something that we're going to cover today, so we'll stop at this particular point. The Steele's Flatback is another type of Pontic which utilizes a prefabricated facing. And this model which I've got here, I think, illustrates the principle of the Steele's Flatback quite nicely. The facing here, which can be either normal porcelain or vacuum-fired porcelain, or can be resin facing, slides on a precious metal backing. This is an enlarged model, of course. And the method of securing the facing is to cement it in position on the backing. The facing itself can be ground on the incisal, on the proximals here, and on the labial to contour it and so on. And the backing is then trimmed to exactly match the facing round here after that's done. The one area that cannot be ground, of course, is this fitting surface here, which goes against the Steele's backing. Now, here is an actual Steele's backing. That was an enlarged model, and this shows you the actual Steele's backing and facing, which is mounted on a little display model here. This is the precious metal backing, and there I think you can see the facing quite well. This is in a high fusing gold to which a casting can be made against that. This has, of course, to be trimmed after the facing has been cut and modified to suit the particular clinical case. And just down here we've got 4 facings here. These facings are made for all teeth. Here's a mandibular incisor, a maxillary cuspid, here's a maxillary molar, and a maxillary incisor. And you can see here on the fitting surface the central groove here that adapts to the backing. And these, of course, are the labial surfaces of this particular one. This one's got a mark across there, as you may notice. This is because they come from a mold guide. And all of the facings have been marked that way, so no one will be tempted to take them out and actually use them, and then you get deficiencies in the mold guide. So that is just an artifact cut across the facing there. Now, as with all of these facings, it's necessary to select a shade, and as I said, the facings are available in normal porcelain, in vacuum-fired porcelain, and also in some molds are available in resin facings. If you're using the normal porcelain facing, then you use the new hue shade guide to select the shade for the particular case. If you're going to use a vacuum-fired porcelain facing, then you use the same bioform shade guide that we utilized in the case of the long pin facing. If you're going to use one of the resin types of facing, then you use the biotone shade guide to select the particular facing. Whichever type of facing you're going to use, the mold is selected from the same mold guide. And here we have the mold guide for these Steele's Flatback teeth. They come in quite a reasonable range of maxillary anteriors here, molars here, mandibular anteriors, cuspids, and so on. So out of this, it's possible to select reasonably well a tooth that will match any particular case. So that if you've got a clinical case such as this with a missing lateral incisor and you want to select a facing for it, then measure the width here with either a bowler gauge or with a suitable pair of dividers like this, and then run through the selection here of the lateral incisors until you find one that is about the right size. Pull it off, and then try that in position on the cast, as you see there. Now, probably you select one in the first instance just a little bit too wide and a little bit too long, because you've got to grind and adapt it to the cast here. You want to adjust the incisal edge, and you want to develop the correct proximal contour. So this particular one we selected here is quite a reasonable selection for this particular case. So you get, again, a shade from one of those shade guides. You select the mold. The mold has a code number to it. This is N2, so you use N2 mold and the appropriate shade which you selected from the appropriate shade guide. This diagram shows a labial lingual section through a maxillary anterior pontic in which the steel's flatback facing has been utilized. It shows the relationship between the porcelain here, the gold here, and the soft tissue of the alveolus here. This lingual contour, of course, has been developed by waxing onto the precious metal backing and then investing and casting that backing on to give the correct lingual contour. An important point to notice in this type of pontic, the steel's flatback, is the problem of incisal protection. Because this facing slides on and off in this direction, it's not possible to have incisal protection in which the gold is brought over the incisal edge as it is done in the long pin facing. This has to be free to slide on and off in this direction. Incisal protection is gained then by two steps. One is to make sure that the gold backing is left just a little extended here beyond the facing, the porcelain facing. The other is that the porcelain facing here should be streamlined and contoured in this direction to avoid a flat biting edge on it in this situation. And those two are blended together in this way, resulting in the gold being rounded, being just a little more prominent than the porcelain, so that if the patient bites onto any hard object, the first thing which it hits is the gold backing, and the porcelain is protected in that way. This is an important thing to recognize. It's very easy to see it here in an enlarged diagram. It's not quite so easy to achieve in the smaller situation in the mouth, but it's quite critical. Another aspect which is important is in the finishing of the cervical end here, that part of the pontic which fits against the mucosa in this ridge-lap relationship which we've got here. The next diagram here shows a view of the cervical end of the pontic, the aspect of it which would fit against the mucosa. This is the porcelain facing, this is the gold backing, and here is the key extending forward and holding the porcelain in position, which has been cemented on, of course. If it's just made without any modification, you get this type of finish. And there is, of course, a cement line across here and around here, the possibility of that washing out and creating crevices in which food plaque could accumulate. In order to avoid this, it's customary to modify this aspect of the pontic by hollow grinding this part of the porcelain around here in the fabrication of the porcelain. This is hollow ground just around in here where the dotted line indicates. The result of this is that when the backing here is waxed up, wax is carried forward to that line there and covers over this area here, and after it's been cast, this of course appears in gold, so that this surface, this fitting surface of the pontic now has a gold apron extending forward here. And at the time the facing is cemented on by burnishing this down tightly here, a very nice adaptation between gold and porcelain is obtained, which gives a satisfactory surface for contact with the mucosa in the ridge-lap relationship just here. To summarize the main characteristics of the steel's flatback pontic, it can be said then that you can determine aesthetics before operating. This is a prefabricated facing, and as you've seen, they can be selected, they can be adapted, they can be tried in the patient's mouth, and the aesthetics established and discussed with the patient before doing any procedure on the supporting teeth. The laboratory technique for these is comparatively easy. The prefabricated precious metal backing gives a good platform on which the technician can build up the lingual surface or the occlusal surface as the case may be, so that we have an easy laboratory technique. One point to remember about them is that you get no incisal, occlusal or proximal protection, and so cases need to be selected carefully in which this is not a primary requirement. They are easy to repair should they fracture at any time by merely selecting another facing of the correct mold and shade, making any necessary proximal and cervical adaptations to it, and then re-cementing it back in position without taking the bridge out of the mouth. Because of the problems of occlusal protection and the difficulty of obtaining this, they tend these days to be used mainly in the maxillary anteriors, where they have the great advantage of showing almost no gold at all, and therefore produce extremely good aesthetics, which is very acceptable in that situation. The Steele's porcelain biting edge Pontic, although not extensively used, is a useful modification of the Steele's flatback in cases where a translucent incisal edge is required. And I have here on the table two examples, one of the porcelain biting edge, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen, compared with the porcelain flatback, which we've been talking about on the left-hand side of the screen. And I think you can see in this porcelain biting edge situation here how the backing, as it comes down, turns at a right angle towards the lingual and projects out like that, so that it gives a sort of girder support to the porcelain incisal edge down here. And there is no backing on that incisal edge there, so that it can be extremely translucent when required. There is, of course, a danger of fracture in this type of situation, but because of the easy replaceability of the facing, that is not too difficult a situation to deal with. And when aesthetics require this situation, that risk can reasonably be taken. It's best, if possible, to use this only in those cases where the functional incisal pathway would lie on the gold backing, that it would not run across the boundary between the gold and the porcelain biting edge, so that in those cases where you've got a marked vertical overlap of the teeth and wanted translucent incisal edges, this would be an acceptable type of facing to use. In all other aspects of its design and characterizations of the technique and so on, it's similar to the Steele's flatback. So that just to summarize it, we can say that it's got all the same characteristics of the Steele's flatback, plus the ability to get translucent incisal edges. Not often used, but one that one should be familiar with. The Steele's True Pontic is another type of Pontic facing utilizing a preformed facing and a metal backing. It's a sort of modification of the Steele's flatback in a way, made so that it can be used on both posterior and anterior teeth. And these facings are made for all teeth in the mouth except for the mandibular incisors, which are too small to accept this type of retention. It consists, in the case of a bicuspid Pontic, such as you see here, of the backing and the porcelain base. This is an enlarged model, of course. And again, this has to be ground and adapted on the fitting surface here and on the proximals and so on. And then when that's correctly designed, the top is cut down to the exact size, and the occlusal surface is then waxed onto the top here. The boundary between gold and tooth substance here, of course, is predetermined, so that it cannot be modified in any way here, such as you could do with a long pin facing, so that this determines the relationship between the gold protection and the facing here. This is for a bicuspid. Similar ones are used for the molar teeth. It has the advantage, you see, of placing porcelain against the fitting surface and against the axial surfaces, gold being only on the occlusal surface. Here is another enlarged model of a similar type of Pontic, but this is for the anterior teeth, and this is the facing which slides on and off the backing, as you see there. This lingual surface would be waxed in here and would give rise to connectors on either side and so on. No incisal protection can be developed for this type of anterior Pontic, so the same sort of edging is developed here as for the Steele's flatback situation. Now, these facings are made in regular porcelain, and in selecting those, one uses the same new hue shade guide that you use for a regular porcelain in the Steele's flatback. A few molds, however, have been made recently in resin facing, and these are particularly suitable in repair situations. In that case, of course, you use the biotone shade guide in selecting a shade for the resin facings. Similar types of mold guides are available for use in this situation, in the full range of molars that are available for incisor teeth, bicuspids, and molars, and so on. And these are selected in the usual manner. The code number noted, and along with the shade, one can then order the facing, which is required. A few of the different types can be seen here on the bench. This is one for a maxillary cuspid. Here's one for maxillary incisor. This is a molar type facing, and this is a bicuspid facing here, such as this is the small, the actual size model of the one that we were looking at previously. We have also here a model which shows a 4-unit bridge replacing 2 bicuspid teeth, which you can see here, and these are replaced with the true Pontic facing. You notice the nature of the Gould protection as you see it on the labial there, which has been quite skillfully handled in this case. There's the occlusal view, so you see you've got complete protection there. And if I turn it around this way, you can see the lingual view of these, and you notice the same key type of situation that you get with the steel flatback. However, this key situation is out on the lingual surface and is in an area that can readily be cleansed. You can see here, I think, that you've got porcelain on the lingual surface, on the fitting surface, and on the proximal surfaces. And this has always been claimed as one of the great advantages of this steel's true Pontic. If you like, you can develop a similar apron of gold over this area here by hollow grinding in there, much the same way as was done with the steel's flatback facing. So this then is the steel's true Pontic, and you saw 2 bicuspids being replaced in that particular situation. One of the difficulties of the steel's true Pontic is that you do need a fair amount of vertical height, occluso-cervically, in order to get both the gold and the porcelain in. Where this is rather shallow, where you've got a shallow Pontic, you find in adjusting the porcelain that you grind through to the central groove, which is the retentive device. And so there is that limitation that you do need a fair amount of vertical height. They're not used so extensively now as they were, but you will come across many clinical cases with this type of bridge in situation and may need to repair it. Repair is carried out, of course, by just selecting a new facing of the correct shade and mold, making any necessary adaptations to it by grinding and cementing it back in position. When doing repairs, it's often convenient to use the resin facings rather than the porcelain. They're a little easier to grind and less likely to fracture than the porcelain ones. To summarize the main characteristics of the steel's true Pontic then, aesthetics can be determined before operating, as with any of the prefabricated facing type Pontics. The laboratory technique is fairly easy and straightforward because a metal platform is provided for the technician to wax on the lingual or occlusal surface, as the case may be. One disadvantage is that in the anterior region it's not possible to develop incisal or proximal protection with this type of Pontic. An advantage in all situations, of course, is porcelain surface approximating the mucosa. And in addition, this type of Pontic is comparatively easy to repair, as we have already discussed. The all-gold sanitary Pontic is used in mandibular molar regions where aesthetics are not critical. And I have here a model on which I think you can see a typical all-gold Pontic in a 3-unit bridge replacing the first mandibular molar. I think as the camera closes down, you can recognize the approximately 1 millimeter space between the base of the Pontic and the mucosa here. You can see the opening of the embrasures on the distal here and on the mesial here. And on the occlusal surface, you can see the development of the marginal ridges dropping down to the contact point and the connector on the mesial here, and the same thing on the distal, the marginal ridge dropping down to the contact point and the connector between the 2 Pontics here. The embrasures on the buccal surface here, you can see have been well rounded in there and are highly polished. But this type of Pontic serves well in the posterior region where aesthetics are not critical. There is a modification of this type of Pontic which was at one time used quite extensively, and you may come across clinical cases in which it is in use. It's not used too much at the present time. It's the Steele's porcelain sanitary Pontic, and here is a typical Pontic of this type. It has a precious metal table which slides on and off the top of the Pontic here. The lower part of the Pontic is intended to be shaped and to go against the mucosal surface. The precious metal table here is used to wax up the occlusal surface on this. So the Pontic consists of two parts, really. The gold occlusal surface here, which takes the main stress, and then an undersurface of porcelain against the mucosal tissue. Not used too much these days, but one should be aware of its existence. Occasionally comes in as a clinical case with the porcelain broken. And of course, as with all the Steele's types of Pontics, you select another base for it here, grind it to shape, and slide it on and cement it in position in the mouth without taking the Pontic out of position. Well, just to summarize the main points of the all-gold sanitary Pontics, the aesthetics are not good. The biological tolerance of these, so far as the tissues of the mouth are concerned, if they're well polished, if they're a good casting, the biological tolerance is good. They have the great advantage, of course, of being strong. They resist the many forces and so on that fall upon them in the posterior mandibular region extremely well. The reverse pin facing was developed 10 years ago or so by Shushan. It has the advantage of allowing almost any porcelain tooth to be used as a bridge facing. And so it opens up for our access the whole range of denture porcelain teeth in all their many shades, molds, and characterizations. The essential nature of the reverse pin facing Pontic can be seen on this diagram here, in which you see a typical Pontic for a maxillary anterior tooth, in which this would be porcelain on the labial surface, and this is the gold backing on the lingual surface of the tooth. And here you see the modified ridge lap to the mucosal surface here. You can see that there are a number of gold pins which extend forward into the porcelain facing. And the technique in using these porcelain facings is to take any denture tooth, grind the lingual surface of it flat, and then with suitable carbide drills, drill in these holes to a depth of a couple of millimeters or so. When the backing is waxed up, nylon pins are placed into here, and when the backing is invested and cast, of course, it comes out with what I'll call reverse pins going into the porcelain. The facing is then cemented into position on here in the normal manner. You can use any porcelain tooth that happens to be convenient from the point of view of mold and shade for this situation. The stress between porcelain and gold is well distributed over quite a number of pins, so that fracture is reduced to a minimum in these cases. You can give any type of incisal or proximal protection to the porcelain that may be required. So this then is the essential nature of the reverse pin facing. Just to summarize the main characteristics of the reverse pin facing, it's easy to control aesthetics like it is with any preformed facing, because you can select the facings ahead of time, grind them, adjust them, and try them in the mouth. It opens up perhaps the widest range of porcelain facings for use in bridge work, because you can use any denture tooth or any bridge type of facing in this technique. The lab technique is a little difficult for any technician who is not accustomed to the procedure, but once it's been mastered and dealt with, it is not particularly laborious to do. By and large, this type of Pontic is not easily repaired. One has to bear in mind, however, that a correctly designed reverse pin facing will very rarely ever fracture. A variety of systems have been developed in the last 6 or 7 years for the use of porcelain fused to gold on bridge Pontics. These techniques offer the advantage of giving almost complete coverage of gold and the potentiality of excellent aesthetics in these situations. This diagram shows a maxillary central incisor Pontic situation on which this would be labial and this would be lingual over here. And this represents the gold core which has to be made for the porcelain to be fused over this. And if we can now look at the porcelain situation in relation to the gold, you can see from this diagram where the porcelain area is just fading in and out, the relationship of that porcelain to the gold core. There has to be a 1 to 2 millimeter thickness of porcelain around this area of the gold on the labial and on the incisal and onto the lingual surface. And notice how you have a feather edge as the porcelain tapers off to a fine edge, quite distinct from normal relationships of porcelain to gold. And the same thing happens all the way down here. So I think if that just fades in and out a little, we can recognize here the relationship between the gold core here and then the porcelain which is built onto that and brought round interproximally, but the gold core is left exposed interproximally here to allow for soldering to the retainer or to the next Pontic. This then is a relationship between the porcelain and the gold core. The even layer of porcelain over the labial, the incisal and round onto the lingual. The tapering edge leading off here and all around there, and the gold core exposed in the contact area for relationship to the adjacent retainer or Pontic. I have two cases here which are in the process of being made, and I thought it would be interesting just to bring them along so that you could take a look at them. This is a mandibular bridge replacing the mandibular incisors, and in this particular situation, because of the patient's preferences and the narrow space in here, 3 incisor teeth are being placed between the two cuspids there, and this is a casting with the sprue still in position of the gold cores, which when they're finished are going to be used to carry the porcelain overlay when it's fused on here in the furnace. These particular Pontics have been cast as one unit, as you can see, so that when they're finished, soldering is only necessary at each end of the string of 3 Pontics. Here is another case of a maxillary bridge replacing the 4 maxillary incisors, and this is at the framework stage here. This is Ceramco gold, and you can see the gold core for the 4 Pontics along here. Notice that this casting has not yet been finished, and what has to be done here is that the embrasures here and here have to be cut into with a carborundum disc and opened to give the necessary opening for cleansing and so on in that region. I'll just turn it over and you can see the lingual surface which is being developed here. The porcelain, of course, comes up, forms an incisal edge, and then just comes down onto this lingual surface and finishes with a tapered edge in that situation. To summarize the main points of the porcelain fused to gold Pontic, then, it is difficult to control aesthetics with this type of Pontic facing because you have no preformed porcelain with which to try out in the clinical case, and you do not see the finished situation until the bridge is complete, when it's often a little difficult to make any major changes. It is important, therefore, that you give adequate information to the technician on mold and shade, and whenever the situation is critical, to send them some type of preformed facing as a guide as to just exactly what is required. They are difficult to repair, but fortunately, if they're correctly designed, they very rarely break. When they do break, it's generally necessary to remove the bridge from the mouth in order to effect a satisfactory repair. The aesthetics of these cases can be extremely good if they're well done and it's carefully controlled, with the great advantage that no gold need show at all. They do require greater skill from the technician, both in the development of the gold core to their correct and effective shape, and also in the blending and the molding of the porcelain to the correct mold and the correct shade. The modern tooth resins have good color stability and good resistance to abrasion, and they make very useful and satisfactory facings for bridge Pontics. The typical relationship of the gold and resin of a bridge Pontic is seen in this diagram here. This represents a bicuspid Pontic with a ridge lap relationship to the mucosa. This would be the buccal surface with the resin facing here. This is the lingual surface with the gold backing and occlusion here. The resin is held in position, is retained by these retention beads which you see around here. They're added at the wax pattern stage, and after the casting has been formed, the outer part is ground off flat here just to retain the retentive area here and to give maximum space for the resin facing. If we take a look at this part of the diagram, which is a cross-section through one of these pontics parallel to the occlusal plane, the point which should be noticed here is the development of the window for the resin in this region here. It has to be extended sufficiently far to the buccal to enable a soldered joint or cast connector to be put in here without interfering with the facing. It needs to be tucked sufficiently into the interproximal space here that the gold is not visible in the normal view of the pontic, so that maximum aesthetics are maintained. Just to summarize the main points then of the gold and resin pontic, as with all types of pontic in which you do not use a preformed facing, it's difficult to control aesthetics, which you do not see really until the bridge is completed, when it's perhaps a little bit late to make any significant changes. Because of this, it requires great skill on the part of the technician in the development of the correct mold and color form, and it requires good communication between the clinician and his technician. Should these pontics wear or fracture or break out in any way, they are difficult to repair and often require the removal of the bridge to effect a satisfactory repair. The important thing to remember is that whatever type of pontic is used, the same basic principles of design apply. And perhaps one of the most important things in the whole business of constructing bridge pontics is to have good communications between the clinician and his technician. And as a clinician, one should always make sure that one sends to the technician the maximum amount of information on just exactly what you want. This will make for the most effective end result.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.